Can a person exist in more than one place at the same time? What if time flows differently for us and for them? Did Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah truly possess such karamas? Could he really appear in multiple places at once? In the Quran, the person who brought the throne of Bilqis in a single moment was not a prophet, but a scholar. And this shows that Allah can grant karamahs to some of his servants. And there is even more. There were jinn troubling a young girl until his name was mentioned. Jinn could not escape, and they were punished severely. One day, Shaitan called out from the darkness, "I am your Rabb." And the answer Abdul Qadir gave to that voice changed everything. In this video, we dive deep into the lesser-known karamas of Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah. The bending of time, the folding of space, knowledge never learned from any teacher, and the unseen world itself. You are watching Religious Story TV. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, support us with your comments. If you are ready, let's begin. It was the darkest hour of the night. In the village of Nif, in the town of Jilani, inside a small house, Sayyid Musa was in a deep sleep. His pregnant wife Fatima was resting beside him. That night, nothing would be ordinary anymore. But Sayyid Musa did not know this yet. Then the dream came. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was standing together with his companions in an unbelievably beautiful place. Everywhere was filled with nur. The heart of Sayyid Musa suddenly felt wide and peaceful, but he also felt shy out of respect. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam turned to him and said,
"O Abu Saleh, Allah, the one who has power over everything, has given you tonight a complete, mature, and highly honored son. He is my son and my beloved. His rank and honor will become very high and great."
When morning came, Sayyid Musa jumped out of his bed. The sky looked strangely bright. According to narrations, the surroundings were shining with light, and on that day, his wife Fatima Hatun gave birth to a baby boy. The year was 470 Hijri. It was the middle of the great Seljuk Empire period. The world did not know him yet, but the heavens knew him. The child's name was Abdul Qadir. His lineage reached the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam from both his father's and mother's side, from Hassan radiallahu an on his father's side, and from Hussein radiallahu an on his mother's side. He was both a Sayyid and a Sharif. Even this alone was extraordinary. But the extraordinary events did not stop there. It was the month of Ramadan. Baby Abdul Qadir would not drink his mother's milk from the first light of dawn until iftar. At first, nobody noticed it. But as the days passed, the people of the village understood. This baby was fasting during the daytime. A baby, still wrapped in cloth. That year, the sky was cloudy, and nobody could clearly understand whether Ramadan had ended or not. The moon could not be seen. The calculations became confusing. The villagers did not know what to do anymore. Finally, someone suggested an idea. Go to Fatima Hatun, ask whether the child is drinking milk or not. So they went. They asked. No, he did not drink today either. Then Ramadan had not ended yet. The fasting continued. The fasting of a tiny baby was informing an entire village that Ramadan was still continuing. Think about this. He could not speak yet. He could not walk yet. But his heart was beating according to the rhythm of time itself. Before his stomach, his soul was speaking. His mother, Fatima Hatun, was not an ordinary woman either. In narrations, she is mentioned among the female awliya. She was called Ummul Khair, the woman of goodness. Her grandfather was also a person of taqwa and knowledge. Abdul Qadir was nourished from these two sources, from the spiritual depth of his mother and from the knowledge of his grandfather. Another interesting karama is also narrated. Flies would never land on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This was one of the signs of his prophethood. And according to narrations, this quality passed down through the family line to Abdul Qadir as well. Flies would not land on him either. Such a child could never be an ordinary child. Centuries later, Imam Rabbani rahimahullah would say, "All spiritual blessings that reach the awliya after him come through his path." But on that night, in that small village of Nif, nobody knew this yet. Only a father had awakened from his dream. Only a mother had held her child in her arms. Only the sky was shining a little brighter than usual. And the world was quietly preparing itself for someone whose name it had not even heard yet. Little Abdul Qadir reached the age of 10, but he was not like the other children because he was hearing voices, not whispers, clear, strong voices meant only for him. They were not saying his name, but he could feel their presence. It was as if they were walking beside him, as if they were moving around him. One morning, an old and pious man appeared in front of him on the road. The man froze the moment he saw Abdul Qadir. Then he turned to the people beside him, his voice trembling. "Do you see it? Right now, angels are moving around this child." Abdul Qadir said nothing. He simply kept walking, but the real turning point was coming very soon. The other children were running around and playing games. One day, Abdul Qadir wanted to join them. After all, he was still a child too. But just as he was about to enter the game, the voice came, "Come, O blessed child." Suddenly, a deep shiver filled his body. Without even turning back, he ran toward his mother. Breathing heavily, he reached the door and held tightly onto her. His mother asked, "What happened?" Abdul Qadir could not answer. He was only trembling. Later, he would understand. Those voices were coming from angels, but at that age, only 10 years old, it was not knowledge yet. It was only a feeling, a strange excitement and fear mixed together. But these experiences would become even more frightening, and they would continue to grow stronger. Then one day, on the morning of Arafat, he experienced something truly extraordinary. Abdul Qadir had gone to the field to work. He was behind an ox, plowing the hard soil. The ground was rough, and the air had become cold. It was an ordinary morning, but suddenly the animal stopped. Then it turned toward Abdul Qadir and spoke.
Ya Abdul Qadir, you were not created for this. You were not commanded for this.
The moment the animal spoke, Abdul Qadir felt both shock and weakness inside himself. It was fear mixed with something else. Maybe recognition, maybe understanding. He immediately left the animal and ran. He reached home and climbed onto the roof without even stopping to breathe, and there he saw it. Allah had brought distant lands before his eyes. Thousands of people were standing in the plain of Arafat in worship. It was the season of Hajj. People were raising their hands toward the sky, begging Allah with tears and prayers, and Abdul Qadir was seeing all of this with his own eyes, from Gilani, from the roof of a tiny village house, as a 10-year-old child. Something inside him broke at that moment, and at the same time, something new was built within him. He came down from the roof and went to his mother. There was no fear or crying left in his voice anymore. There was clarity. That strange clarity that sometimes comes when a person is very small, but their heart speaks with great strength. "Mother, dedicate me to the path of Allah. I want to go to Baghdad. I want to learn knowledge, find the friends of Allah, and receive blessings from their gatherings. They are calling me from there," Fatima Hatun cried. Of course she cried. Her son was still only a child. Abdul Qadir had already grown up without a father. He had lost his father at a young age, and his mother and grandfather had raised him. And now this child stood before her with that strange light in his eyes, speaking about Baghdad. But there was also a voice inside his mother's heart. And that voice was saying, this child was already born to leave. This was the childhood of Abdul Qadir. It had passed among the whispers of angels. He had been chosen by Allah and protected from becoming attached to the dunya. While the other children were chasing games and laughter, he had stood on the roof of his home, watching Arafat from far away. Mother Fatima did not sleep that night. Her son's words were still echoing in her ears, I want to go to Baghdad. These words, coming from such a small child, were not an ordinary wish. Morning came. She had made her decision. She stood up and opened the chest. Inside were 80 gold coins left behind by her husband. She separated half of them for her other child. Then she sewed a hidden pocket under Abdul Qadir's kaftan and placed the remaining 40 gold coins inside it. The pocket was under the arm area, in a place nobody could see. When she finished sewing her son's clothes, the time for farewell had come. She called Abdul Qadir beside her and said, go on the path of knowledge, begin your journey. But never forget this. No matter what happens to you, no matter what you face, never tell a lie, never leave the path of truth. Most likely, I will not see you again until Qiyamah. And exactly as she said, it happened. Fatima Hatun never saw her son again after that day, until Qiyamah. A mother was sending away her son while knowing it would be their final meeting, yet she still told him to go. Because if he stayed, only 2 eyes would miss him here. But if he left, millions of people would one day wait for his path. That morning, Abdul Qadir joined a small caravan. A long and unknown road stood before him, from Gilani to Baghdad, crossing mountains, a journey that would last for weeks. He had no sword and no protector beside him, only 40 gold coins sewn under his kaftan and a promise he had taken from his mother. The journey began. Days passed. When the caravan came near Hamadan, the sky had already become dark. Empty roads ahead, empty roads behind. Then suddenly the sound of horses rose from every direction, a band of 60 armed bandits on horseback. They surrounded the caravan, shouting, crying, the sound of metal everywhere. Everything the travelers owned was taken from them. One of the bandits approached Abdul Qadir. He probably looked like a lonely and frightened child. The man laughed and mockingly asked, "Do you have anything valuable?" Abdul Qadir looked directly into the man's eyes. "I have 40 gold coins." The man laughed and walked away, thinking he was joking. Then another man came and asked the same question. He received the same answer. He also did not believe him and walked away laughing. Finally, they informed the leader of the bandits. The leader became curious. What if the child was actually telling the truth? Abdul Qadir was brought before the leader. The leader asked, "Do you really have gold?" "Yes, it is sewn under the arm of my kaftan." They removed the kaftan. They opened the stitching, and they found the gold. They counted it, exactly 40 gold coins. Everyone became silent. Everyone was shocked. Then the leader slowly asked, "If you had stayed silent, nobody would have searched there. Why did you tell us?" And Abdul Qadir answered with these words, "My mother warned me never to lie. No matter what happens, she told me never to leave the truth. I gave her my word. I must keep my promise." The face of the bandit leader changed. His eyes filled with tears. A bandit trying to hold back tears. It was strange, unexpected, and deeply shaking. His voice became weak as he said, "For years I did not keep the promises I gave to my Rabb. But this young boy stayed loyal to the promise he gave his mother." Then he stood up and shouted loudly, "I repent to Allah." One by one, the others came forward. Their hands held Abdul Qadir's hand as words of tawbah came out from their mouths. They returned everything they had stolen from the caravan, including the 40 gold coins. Years later, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah would describe this event by saying, "The first people who repented through me were this group of bandits." That morning, the 40 gold coins sewn into the kaftan by Fatima Hatun did not only change one caravan, They changed the destiny of 60 human beings, and Abdul Qadir had not even reached Baghdad yet. When he first saw Baghdad, it felt as if the city was about to swallow him whole. It was the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, the greatest center of knowledge, culture, and spiritual wisdom in the Islamic world. Its mosques, madrasas, scholars, markets, noise and smells. Everything was mixed together, everything was alive, everything was enormous. For a young boy coming from Gilani, this city was like an ocean, and Abdul Qadir dived into that ocean, silently, with determination. He knocked on the doors of the most famous scholars of his time. He learned hadith, fiqh, and tasawwuf. He built deep friendships with some of the great people of tasawwuf in Baghdad. Years passed. Drop by drop, with patience after patience, he pulled that ocean into himself. But something was disturbing him. The Hanbali madhab was dying. This great madhab, founded by Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal radiallahu an, was almost forgotten in Baghdad. It still existed in books, but it was no longer truly alive, taught, or practiced. And according to narrations, one night, Abdul Qadir saw Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal radiallahu an in a dream. The Imam asked him to revive this madhab. When Abdul Qadir woke up, he had made his decision. He had been following the Shafi'i madhab, but he entered the Hanbali madhab and began working with all his strength to raise it again. And later, after he became famous through his sermons, the Hanbali madhab slowly began spreading through Baghdad once more. Then the day came for him to give his first sermon from the pulpit. At first, only a few people came, but in the following sermons, the number slowly increased. As his sermons spread through the city, thousands and then tens of thousands began coming. People could no longer fit inside the madrasa. Crowds overflowed into the streets. The surrounding houses were purchased and added to expand the madrasa, but even that was not enough. They moved to open-air gatherings, and according to narrations, crowds of 70,000 people came from different regions to listen to him in Baghdad. 70,000 people in the open air, gathering just to listen to one man. Even the people standing in the farthest rows could hear his voice clearly, something strange and difficult to explain by normal means. 3 days every week, Monday, Tuesday, and Friday night, he gave sermons, and this continued without interruption for 40 years. Hundreds of scholars wrote down his lessons. The famous books that reached us today were actually notes taken by those scholars during his sermons. There was something different about him on that pulpit. His words entered the hearts because they had first entered his own heart. One day, some of Baghdad's famous scholars gathered together and said, "Let us go and test this Abdul Qadir." They came and entered the madrasa, preparing difficult questions in their minds. But they could not ask a single question. A spiritual effect spread from the chest of Abdul Qadir Jilani rahimahullah into their hearts. And at that moment, they forgot everything they knew. It was as if their minds had become completely empty. When Abdul Qadir saw their condition, he embraced them one by one. And the moment he embraced them, they remembered everything they had forgotten. Then they asked their questions, and they received their answers. When they left, they turned to one another and said, "When we sat in his presence, we forgot all our knowledge, but when he embraced us, we remembered it again, and the answers we received left us in amazement." There is another narration as well. One day, while Abdul Qadir was speaking from the minbar during a gathering, he suddenly stopped. He slowly walked down to the lowest step of the pulpit. He folded his hands over his chest and lowered his gaze with deep respect. Everyone became confused and shocked. Then, after a short time, he slowly climbed back to the highest step and continued speaking. After the gathering ended, the people asked, "What happened to you, our master?" And Abdul Qadir replied, "My grandfather, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came. He stood before the minbar. Out of respect for him, I stepped down and waited for his command. Then he said to me, "Go and give sermons to the people." So I climbed back up again. Baghdad no longer saw him as only a scholar. He had become a murshid, a guide, a doorway through which people entered into the depths of their hearts. But these glorious days would one day pause, because the voice growing inside Abdul Qadir was calling him away from everything, away from the madrasa, away from the crowds, away from the city. That voice was calling him toward the desert. One morning, he stood up and left everything behind. The madrasa, the students, the pulpit, the open-air lessons where 70,000 people gathered to hear him, the noise of Baghdad, the love of the people, the respect of the scholars, all of it. In a single moment of decision, he could not ask anyone for advice because they might try to stop him. So he quietly walked toward the deserts of Iraq, toward ruins, toward loneliness. According to narrations, this seclusion lasted for 25 years. 25 long years, the entire youth of a man. And during this time, in his own words, "Nobody knew about me and I knew nobody." But why? Because Abdul Qadir had understood something. No matter how bright a person may look from the outside, there can still be an unfinished war inside. That war was called the Nafs, and nobody could fight that battle on his behalf. He entered the deserts. He began living among the ruined places around Baghdad. He was completely alone, and he was not used to it. The first days were difficult. The first weeks were even harder. But the real struggle was not physical loneliness. The real struggle came from inside, and the Nafs began to speak. Every night was a battle. Every morning was another test. Abdul Qadir kept himself hungry, not only his body, but also his desires. He climbed difficult hills on purpose, simply because they were hard. Every time his nafs said enough, he forced himself to take one more step. One night, he was reciting the Quran. But after some time, sleepiness came over him. Then he heard that inner voice, "Sleep a little, then you can continue later." Abdul Qadir stopped immediately. He recognized that voice. It was the voice of the Nafs. And was this not the most dangerous form of the Nafs? A request that looked reasonable, sounded innocent, yet slowly pulled a person away from Allah. He stood up. Then he began reciting Quran while standing on one leg until the time of Fajr prayer. His goal was to silence the voice of the Nafs and show that the true master was Allah. But later, Shaitan would come as well. The enemy was not only one. Shaitan began appearing in different forms, and one day he prepared his greatest trap. A massive light suddenly appeared before Abdul Qadir's eyes. It covered the horizon, a beautiful and overwhelming light. Then a voice came from that light. "O Abdul Qadir, I am your Lord. I became so pleased with your worship that from this day onward, I have made the haram things halal for you." But the moment Abdul Qadir heard those words, something inside him became hard and firm. "Get away from me, O Shaitan. The light you show me is eternal darkness for me." This time Shaitan spoke differently, with a defeated voice. "With the wisdom and insight your Lord has given you, you escaped from me once again. Yet by this method, I have misled hundreds of people." Then Shaitan asked him, "How did you recognize me?" And Abdul Qadir answered, "If a person could become free from haram because of righteous deeds, then this would have first happened to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Since even he was never given such an exception, nobody else can ever receive it." Years passed. His desires and worldly cravings slowly melted away like ice, and then strange things began happening. He would pluck a leaf from a tree in his hand, and it would turn into sweet halwa. He would touch salty sea water, and it would become sweet. 18 years had passed in the deserts. Then one morning, a feeling rose inside him. The time to return had come. He turned his face toward Baghdad and began walking. From far away, the walls of the city appeared before him. He approached the gates, and there, someone was standing. Abdul Qadir froze. The one before him was Khidr alayhi salam. Allah Azza wa Jal has a command for you, Khidr said. You must wait 7 more years before entering Baghdad. 7 more years. After 18 years, 7 more. 25 years in total. When Abdul Qadir heard this command, he accepted it completely with his heart. Of course, he said, I will wait another 7 years. Then he turned back toward the ruined desert lands once again. And for 7 more years, he lived near the borders of Baghdad, buried from everyone, remembering his Rabb. Then one cold and rainy night, after exactly 25 years, he heard a voice from the unseen, Now you are free. That night, he entered Baghdad. The wet earth cracked softly beneath his feet. The lights of the city trembled in the distance. The man who returned to this city after 25 years was no longer the same person who had left it. Now the Nafs could no longer control him. Now Shaitan could no longer deceive him. Now the dunya could no longer hold him. And Baghdad would soon understand this very clearly. The faces in Baghdad had changed, but this silence would not last long. Around that time, his teacher Abu Sa'id Mahzumi had passed away. His madrasa stood empty. Abdul Qadir settled there and began teaching once again. And slowly, the madrasa started filling up. People began recognizing him again. Then one day there was a knock on the door. A woman entered the courtyard of the madrasa. She was middle-aged, tired-looking, with that familiar expression found in mothers, love and worry together, pride and fear together. She had come to see her son, but the moment she entered, she froze. Her son was there, sitting in the corner of the room, weak, pale, almost nothing but skin and bones. His face had lost its color. Dark circles sat under his eyes. His clothes had become loose because his body had grown thinner inside them. In front of him were only dry bread and olives. He ate nothing else. The mother's heart tightened with pain, because on the other side of the room sat Abdul Qadir Jilani, rahimahullah, calmly eating roasted chicken from a plate before him. Peaceful, relaxed, calm. All the mercy inside the mother suddenly turned into anger. "Oh, Master, my son is dying from hunger while you sit here eating chicken." Abdul Qadir Jilani rahimahullah slowly lifted his head and looked at the woman. Then he turned toward the chicken on his plate. He stretched out his hand and touched the bones, cooked bones, separated and scattered across the plate. Then he said, "By the permission of Allah, rise and live again." The bones began to move. They came together. Flesh covered them. Feathers appeared, and the cooked chicken suddenly jumped alive from the plate, flapping its wings and making sounds. The woman became speechless. Then Abdul Qadir Jilani rahimahullah turned toward her and said, "When your son reaches this level, then he too may eat chicken." He paused for a moment, then continued, "A person's soul must control his body, his mind must control his stomach, his heart must control his nafs. He should desire pleasure only for the sake of gratitude toward Allah. Your son is learning this now. Real mercy is not protecting him from this training. Real mercy is allowing him to complete it." The woman understood. While narrating this story, Bediuzzaman Sayyid Nursi rahimahullah says that true compassion was not preventing the student from this training of the nafs, because the one who completed this training would become free both in this dunya and in the akhirah. But what exactly was the training of the nafs? Abdul Qadir Jilani rahimahullah used to say, "If you fulfill every desire of your nafs, it becomes your master. But if you discipline it, then you become its master." It sounds like a simple sentence, but inside it is the summary of an entire lifetime, because the nafs is intelligent, the nafs is patient, the nafs never gives up. If it cannot destroy you from one direction, it comes from another. If hunger cannot break you, it tries to break you through fame. If fame cannot break you, it tries comfort instead. And according to many scholars, the Nafs can even be more dangerous than Shaitan. Because Shaitan is outside of you, but the Nafs is inside you. Many times a person forgets about the Nafs, cannot separate himself from it, and becomes deceived by it. And Shaitan knows this very well. That is why Shaitan whispers to the Nafs, speaks through the Nafs, and then the person begins to think those whispers are his own thoughts. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah himself had experienced this in the past. The reason he spent 25 years in the desert, fighting a new battle every single night, was to purify the Nafs and become a true servant of Allah. He became the man who stood on one foot until morning. He became the man who looked at Shaitan's false light and recognized it as darkness. His understanding of tasawwuf was simple. It came from real life. He guided people not only with words, but with his state and character. His students learned by watching him. And perhaps today, even though we speak about Islam, we sometimes cannot deeply affect others because we are not fully living what we say. That is why, before teaching something to people, we must first live it ourselves. Most of the time, people are influenced not by speeches, but by what they see in our actions. And by the permission and help of Allah, hearts may enter this path. Allah is the one who holds the hearts. We are only means, but first, we must live it. In the madrasa, he was a teacher. In the streets, he was a dervish. And in the hearts of people, he was a murshid. The door of his home was always open. Not a single night passed without guests. His servant would stand at the door and call out, "Is there anyone hungry? Is there anyone searching for a place to sleep? Let anyone who needs bread come inside." On one of the streets of Baghdad around midday, the voices of two young men were rising loudly. One was Muslim, the other was Christian. They were arguing about which prophet was greater. At that exact moment, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah was passing by. He heard the argument and asked the Christian young man who was defending Isa alayhi salam, "What is your proof?" The young man replied, "Our prophet could bring the dead back to life. Nobody can reach his level." Then Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah said, "If I also bring a dead person back to life by the permission of Allah, will you accept that Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam is greater?" The young man smiled mockingly. "Of course I will." Then Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah said, "Then show me a very old grave." The Christian young man thought for a moment. Then they walked toward the outskirts of the city. Finally, they reached an old grave near the edge of Baghdad. Its stones were broken and scattered. The grave looked abandoned. The young man stopped and said mockingly, "Here it is. Let us see your Karamat." Everyone who had followed Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah stood waiting silently. It was as if even the wind itself had stopped. Then Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah turned toward the grave. He closed his eyes and softly whispered, "Rise by the permission of Allah." Everyone stared at the ground. Nothing happened. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Then the earth moved. At first, only slightly, as if something beneath the soil had begun breathing. Then more strongly. Stones shifted from their places. The earth cracked open, and a body began rising from inside the grave. A man emerged from the grave and stood up. The mocking expression disappeared from the Christian young man's face. Then Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah turned toward him and said softly, "Will you believe now?" The young man could not speak. He only stepped forward and recited the Shahada. That day, in a quiet corner of Baghdad, a Christian became Muslim. And this was not just a single event. The Karamats of Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah were spreading from tongue to tongue. And among many Christians of that time, a famous saying began spreading, "We cannot accept Islam But we also cannot deny Abdul Qadir Gilani. Islamic scholars are clear about this matter. Things given to prophets as miracles can also appear to awliya as karamas by the permission of Allah. The true owner of both is Allah alone. And Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah understood this very well. That is why he tried to hide his karamas whenever possible. He used to say, "Karamas are only shown for a goodness or a wisdom. The one who openly displays his karamas without reason is attached to the dunya." But that day, beside that grave, hiding the karama was not necessary, because one's soul was waiting for hidayah, and there was another soul as well in another place, at another time. A man once saw his father in a dream. His father was suffering in punishment and said to him, "Go and ask Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah to make dua for me. If he prays, Allah will save me from this punishment." The man woke up in the morning and immediately ran to the madrasa. He explained everything. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah said nothing. He only listened quietly. The next day the man returned again, but this time his face was smiling. "I saw my father again in my dream last night," he said. "He was dressed in green clothes. He looked happy. The punishment had ended." Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah never believed any of these things came from himself. He knew that everything came only from Allah. There was little time left before Jumu'ah prayer. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah was walking together with his students when a man approached them. This man was someone who denied the karamas of Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah. He said, "O Sheikh, people say that true murshids can make time submit to them and complete works in a very short time that would normally take many years. Is this true?" Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah replied, "Allah Ta'ala gives such strength to his dervishes that they can complete works in a short time, which would normally require 10 or 15 years." The man objected immediately. "I do not believe this. Such things belong only to Allah." Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah smiled gently and said, "There are servants under the control of Allah who can do whatever Allah allows them to do. Nothing can stand against them." The time for Jumu'ah was getting very close. After this short conversation, everyone began making wudu. The man who had asked the question touched water with his hands, and at that exact moment, everything changed. He suddenly found himself inside a marketplace. It was not Baghdad, it was another city. He was standing in front of a locksmith shop. Inside, a master craftsman was working with metal. The man stood there in shock. Was this a dream? Then, while thinking, he became fascinated by the craftsman. He watched him for a long time. Finally, he walked inside and asked, "Can you teach me this craft?" The master lifted his head and replied, "You seem like an educated man. Why do you want this trade?" The man answered, "I want to earn halal sustenance." The master accepted his answer, and the man became his apprentice. He worked there for 4 years. He learned locksmithing. His hands became rough and covered with calluses. In time, the master died, and the man ended up marrying the master's widow. He had 2 sons. Years passed. Then one morning he came to his shop. He bent down to light the furnace. He touched a piece of iron, and suddenly he found himself back at the fountain for wudu. His hands were still inside the water. The prayer rug still hung on the tree exactly as he had left it. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah and his students had only walked a few steps ahead. How had so many years passed while no time had passed here? He had lived another life in another city. He had married, had children, become a master craftsman. And now he was back here, as if only a single second had passed after touching the water. He grabbed his prayer rug and ran. He caught up just as Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah was entering the congregation for prayer. Then they prayed Jumu'ah together. After the prayer ended, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah turned toward him and asked, Well, are you still denying? The man slowly explained everything he had experienced. I do not know what this state is, he said. Was it imagination? Was it a dream? Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah replied seriously, it was neither imagination nor a dream, it truly happened. The man repented to Allah. Then he wished to see his wife and children again. And later his wife and children were brought from that region and they reunited. From that day until his death, he never left the service of Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah. But how was this possible? How could a person who was not a prophet show such miracles and karamas? The Quran had already answered this question long ago. It is mentioned in Surah An-Naml, verses 38 to 42. In these ayat, Sulaiman alayhi salam wanted the throne of Queen Bilqis to be brought before him. An Ifrit from among the Jinn said, I can bring it to you before you rise from your place. Surely I am strong and trustworthy for this task. But then another person spoke, someone who possessed knowledge from the book. I can bring it to you before your eye blinks. And in the continuation of the ayat, the throne is indeed brought with the speed that he promised. This man was not a prophet. So the Quran clearly shows that special servants of Allah can display such karamas by the permission of Allah. When people deny that such things are possible without realizing it, they can end up contradicting the ayat of the Quran itself. Likewise, the wind was made subject to Sulaiman alayhi salam. A distance that normally took 1 month to travel could be crossed in a morning or an evening by the permission of Allah. And for Dawood alayhi salam, reading the Zabur was made easy. Before his animal could even be fully prepared, he would finish reciting the entire long book from beginning to end. Bast Zaman, the stretching of time. Tayy al-Makan, the folding of space. These are realities mentioned in the Quran. Allah can break the normal rules of creation for whichever servants he wills. Ashab al-Kahf remained inside the cave for 309 years. But when they awoke, it felt to them as if only 1 day had passed. They too were not prophets, yet they personally lived inside a miraculous event from Allah. Modern science today accepts that time is relative. Einstein's theory of relativity says that space and time can bend, but there was no need to wait for Einstein to know this. The Quran had already spoken about it long ago. It was the final days of Ramadan. As the time of iftar approached, the streets of Baghdad had become quiet. And that year, many people from Baghdad, scholars, merchants, poor people, respected figures of the city, had invited Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah to break his fast at their homes. That evening, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah left his house. The time for iftar arrived. The adhan was called. And at the same moment, tables were prepared all across Baghdad. Not long after iftar, there was a knock at the door. A man entered, excited and red-faced. Abdul Qadir Gilani broke his fast at our house tonight. The helper smiled politely. No, our master broke his fast here tonight. The man insisted. No, I swear I saw him with my own eyes. Then another knock came. Another man, another house, the same story, then another and another. The news began spreading from house to house. Every person entering said the same thing. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah had sat at their table that night. He had eaten with them, spoken with them, made dua for them, and all of them were telling the truth. Because the people inside the house had also seen Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah with their own eyes there. Yet at the same time, he had attended dozens of other iftar tables across the city. At the same time, on the same night, in the same city, different homes, different people. The same Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah. Knowing that such events only happen by the permission and pleasure of Allah, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah always tried to hide his karamas whenever possible. He used to say, karamas are only shown for a goodness or a wisdom. The one who openly displays his karamas without reason is attached to the dunya. But that night, he could not hide the Karama, because Allah had not allowed it to remain hidden. And far away, in another corner of the city, another strange event was happening. A man named Abu Sa'id had a daughter who was being troubled by Jinn. For days, the family had suffered greatly. Finally, the desperate father came to the door of Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah listened quietly. Then he described a place outside Baghdad, rocky land near water. He told the man to go there, where he would meet the leader of the Jinn and to deliver his salam. The man went, and there he encountered the leader of the Jinn. The Jinn leader said, "Who are you? Humans do not come here." The man replied, "Abdul Qadir Gilani sent me. He sends you salam." The attitude of the Jinn leader immediately changed. "Abdul Qadir, then this is different. For his sake, nobody will touch you." Then the Jinn troubling the girl was found and punished. And the family finally found peace again. Even the Jinn feared him. But Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah still sat upon his prayer rug. He still cried before Allah. He still said, "O Allah, do not leave me alone even for a moment." That was true greatness. Not a greatness that worshipped power, but a greatness that knew the true source of all power and worshipped only him. One day, one of his students asked, "Ya Seda, why do people keep repeating the same mistakes? Why can they not change even when they truly want to?" Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah remained silent for a while. Then he began speaking. And what he explained that day became like a map that would continue touching human hearts even centuries later. Because a person cannot mature until he passes through 7 gates within himself. And these gates are not outside of you. They exist inside your own soul. The first gate, Nafs al-Amara. This is the darkest beginning of the journey. Nafs al-Amara, the nafs that commands evil. This is the most primitive, uncontrolled and raw state of a human being. At this stage, the nafs controls you. Your anger explodes and feels justified. Your jealousy grows and feels normal. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah compared this state to someone who has fallen into the sea without knowing how to swim. And its most dangerous part is this: the person in this state usually does not realize he is in this state. There is only one key to opening the first gate: awareness. A person must be able to say, "My nafs wanted this right now, but by the permission of Allah, I can act differently from what my nafs desires." First, a person must separate himself from his nafs and understand that the nafs is a separate inner mechanism connected to him, but not identical to him. The danger must first be recognized. Most of the time, what a person thinks is himself is actually his nafs. The second gate, Nafs al-Lawama. You say something, then immediately afterward a pain appears inside. Why did I say that? That is the doorway of Lawama. According to Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah, this inner pain is not punishment. It is the inner call of divine mercy. But there are 2 dangers here. Either the person denies this voice and returns to his old state, or he exaggerates the blame and destroys himself completely through guilt. The true path is between these 2 extremes. At this stage, a person must question his actions constantly, search sincerely for the truth, and ask Allah for guidance. The third gate, Nafs al-Mulhima. This is the gate of inspiration. The person who passes through the subtle pain of Lawama slowly begins hearing inner guidance. At moments of decision, a voice inside whispers, "Choose this path." But Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah strongly warned people at this stage. A person must learn to distinguish the source of inspiration. Not every feeling is divine. The cleaner the mirror of the heart becomes, the clearer the reflected inspiration will be. The fourth gate, Nafs al-Mutmainah, this is the station of peace. The person who survives the storms of Mulhima no longer fights constantly with life. Instead, he makes peace with it. In the words of Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah, this is the station where the heart becomes pleased with the decree of Allah. Fear turns into trust. Greed turns into contentment. The sign of Mutmainah is this: being able to find inner calm even in the middle of a storm. The fifth gate, Nafs al-Radiyah. This is the state where the servant becomes pleased with Allah. At this stage, the person stops forcing outcomes. He still makes effort, but the results are left to their true owner. Even dua changes here. Instead of saying, "Give me this," the heart begins saying, "Make me worthy of this." The sixth gate, Nafs al-Mardiyah. This is the state where Allah becomes pleased with the servant. Mardiyah does not arrive through public announcements. It quietly appears in the place where an old inner noise finally dies. One morning you wake up and realize that the fire of endless wanting has turned into ashes. The heart has learned to say, "Let it be as Allah wills." Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah used to say, "In Radiyah, the heart searches for mercy. In Mardiyah, the heart itself becomes mercy." The seventh gate, Nafs al-Kamila. This is the peak of the journey, the magnificent station where the human being reaches completion. But Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah immediately warned people about something important. Perfection is not gaining supernatural powers. True perfection is living ordinary life with truth. At this stage, everything points toward Allah. Causes are no longer seen independently. In the falling of a leaf, in the beating of a bird's wings, the greatness of Allah is witnessed. Not Allah himself, but His majesty, power, and creation. Behind every action is the creation of Allah. Nothing happens through the independent power of creation itself. The creation only desires something. If Allah wills, He creates it. Even now, while you are watching this video, you continue seeing only because Allah keeps creating the act of seeing moment by moment. Seeing itself is a created action. For the people of Kamal, everything becomes a divine manifestation. At this level, the person forgets himself. The claim of I begins dissolving. Actions are no longer done to say, "I did this." Instead, they are done so that the art of Allah may appear through them. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah described the person who reaches Kamal like this: a human being becomes a silent mirror of the divine names upon the earth. Such a person no longer shines because of his own existence. He shines because of what he reflects. At the beginning, the student's question had been, why do we keep repeating the same mistakes? And this was the answer: because we are still standing at the first gate. And if you do not know which gate you are standing before, it becomes impossible to search for its key. Then the student asked quietly, "And which gate are you at, Ya Sayyidah?" Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah smiled gently, sincerely. But he did not answer. And that silence itself was the answer. In one of his gatherings, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah said the following. These words are mentioned in the book Fath al-Rabbani. "O you who cannot find the things your nafs desires, do not desperately wish for your condition to change. Perhaps in the things that are coming toward you, there are matters that may destroy you. O sick person, do not always wish for your illness to disappear completely. Who told you that health is always better for you? Right now you are ill, but you still have Iman. Who can guarantee that when you become healthy, you will not lose that Iman? You may become drowned in dunya and forget Allah and His prophets. Be wise. Do not chase after every passing desire. Throw greed away from your hands. Do not always say, may it increase more and more. Eat what Allah has given you so that it may become goodness for you. But if you insist on taking everything your personal desires want, you may fall into sorrow. Your tongue speaks like a Muslim, but does your heart confirm those words? Your speech sounds like the speech of someone who believes in Allah and His Messenger. but your actions do not match any of it. When you stand among people, nobody appears better than you, but when you are alone, why does your state change? Do you know something? Even if you pray and fast for years, it may still not benefit you. Even if you spend your whole life doing good deeds, you may still not see goodness from them. Only one thing matters, seeking the pleasure of Allah. Turn back from the things you are doing right now. You do not even possess a guarantee for living one more moment. Then Abdul Qadir Gilani, rahimahullah, narrated a story. A man once bought a slave. The slave was a pious and righteous believer. When the man brought him home, he asked, "What kind of food would you like to eat in my house?" The slave replied, "Whatever you give me." The man asked, "What kind of clothes would you like to wear?" "Whatever you dress me in." "What work would you like to do in my house?" "Whatever work you want me to do." The man became frozen after hearing these answers. Tears began falling from his eyes. Then he whispered, "If only I could surrender to my Rabb, the way this slave surrenders to his master." The slave then calmly asked, "Oh, my master, does a slave truly have his own will and choice beside his master?" At that moment, the man immediately freed the slave. After narrating this story, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah stood up and said, "Whoever truly knows Allah, surrenders to him with real love, and becomes pleased with the state Allah has chosen for him, such a person no longer holds on to personal will or selfish choice." Then he said, "He only says, 'What right do I have to ask Allah for anything outside of what He wants for me?'" And in Fath al-Rabbani, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah also says, "When you come to me, come simply. Leave your nafs aside. Abandon your personal desires. Remove me from between yourself and Allah, and see only Him. Even making a dry stone speak is within His power." Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah taught a special dua for people in the hardest situations, Hizbun Nasr. Hizbun Nasr means the dua of the banner of victory. It was a dua shaped over many years, flowing from the deepest cries of Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah to Allah. His students would recite it when they were surrounded by enemies, when they felt trapped, when life itself became suffocating. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah used to say, "O my son, sins are magnets for troubles. If you leave sins, troubles will also leave you, and tawbah is the medicine of troubles." That is why before beginning this great dua, purification was necessary. Honey is not placed into a dirty container because it becomes spoiled. First tawbah, then dua. Allahumma ya man la yuhzamu jundu. O Allah, whose armies are never defeated. This part was for protection, for nazar, for sir, for unseen enemies, for jealous eyes, hidden traps, and secret enemies. Then the dua would rise for rizq, ya razak, ya fata, for debt, for poverty, for times when barakah disappeared from life. Then the dua would turn toward healing, ya shafi, ya tabib al-qulub. For illnesses doctors understand, and for illnesses they cannot understand, for the exhaustion of the soul itself. But Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah especially emphasized one thing. "A door does not open unless it is knocked," he used to say. "You knock first, then wait for it to open. Do not become impatient and walk away from the door." One night, a man entered his gathering. He was drunk. He stumbled as he walked inside and stood before Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah. Then he asked, "Is Allah Qadir?" Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah smiled gently. "He is Qadir." The man asked again, "Is Allah Qadir?" Again he smiled. "He is Qadir." Then the man asked for the third time. This time, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah could no longer smile. His eyes filled with tears. He fell into sajda and repeated 3 times, "He is Qadir, He is Qadir, He is Qadir." Then he cried. He cried for a long time. Later the students asked him, "You smiled at the first 2 questions. Why did you cry at the third?" Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah replied, when he asked the first time, he was really asking, is Allah powerful enough to forgive me? And I answered, He is Qadir. The second time he was asking, is Allah powerful enough to raise me to your station? And again I answered, He is Qadir. But the third time he was asking, is Allah powerful enough to make you fall into my condition? Yes, he said softly, He is Qadir, and that made me cry. That was the essence, that was the true secret of Hizb al-Nasr, and that was the essence of the entire teaching of Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah. You want protection from enemies, and you are right. You want your rizq to open, and you are right. You want healing, and you are right. But beneath all these desires stood one deeper question. Where is your heart? If the heart is attached to dunya, then dua becomes a transaction. But if the heart turns toward Allah, then dua becomes a journey. Then Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah turned toward that drunk man and said to his students, take this man, wash him, clean him, feed him, honor him as a guest. The students were shocked. For a drunk man? That man taught me the greatest lesson tonight. Late that night, the man woke up and found himself clean, warm, and full. And after that night, he was never seen drunk again. One afternoon, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah was staring into the distance. His students were beside him. Suddenly, they saw their master stand up. He rose slowly and turned toward a certain direction. It was as if a scent had reached him, a beautiful, familiar scent coming from very far away. The students looked at one another. Nobody spoke. Then Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah said, 157 years after my death, a great man will appear from this direction. Because Allah engraved dhikr into his heart, he will be called Naqshband. He will reach the blessings specially granted to me. He is a very great wali. When he appears, attach yourselves to him. Then he paused. After that, he went inside and prepared a jubba. He handed it to his students and said, this jubba belongs to the man named Naqshband, who will come after me. I leave it to you as a trust, so you may give it to him. 157 years later, when Muhammad Bahuddin Naqshband, rahimahullah, set out on his journey for Hajj, his route passed from Bukhara toward Baghdad. And when he arrived in Baghdad, that jubba was given to him. The same jubba Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah had prepared and entrusted 157 years earlier. Then Bahuddin Naqshband rahimahullah visited his blessed grave and wrote words of praise for Gauth al-Azam, because he knew this meeting was not coincidence. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah had seen him. He had known his name. He had prepared his jubba. Time was not a barrier for him. But this was not the only example. There was another sign, stranger and reaching much farther into the future, a sign extending 800 years ahead. In the first volume of Abdul Qadir Gilani's work, called Majmu'at al-Ahzab, on page 562, in that sorrowful work where he spoke about unseen matters, there were references to a name, a service, and a light that would come centuries later. And that name was Saeed. Bediuzzaman Saeed Nursi rahimahullah himself mentions these signs in his own works. In Sikhi Tasdiki Gabi, he says, in the story of my life, there were many extraordinary events, most of which I hid. Because I never saw myself worthy of karama in any way, I sometimes explained them through coincidence and sometimes through other causes. But now I have become convinced that these extraordinary events were part of a chain of karamas belonging to Gauth al-Azam. The name Saeed appeared openly on those old pages. It was also mentioned that he would live with dignity and happiness regarding sustenance. And truly, from his childhood onward, Bediuzzaman rahimahullah never lived dependent upon others. There was another sign as well. One expression from Gauth al-Azam, through Sayafar calculation, pointed toward the year 1326, Hijri, indicating that in that time a student would rise to defend the truths of the Quran through spiritual struggle. And in 1908, Bediuzzaman rahimahullah indeed stepped into that struggle. There was also another sign, more personal and more direct. When Bediuzzaman rahimahullah was only 8 or 9 years old, the people around him mostly belonged to the Naqshbandi tariqa, but young Said attached himself instead to Gauth al-Azam. Whenever he lost something, he would quietly say inside himself, "Ya Sheikh, help me find this thing of mine. I will recite one Fatiha for you." And shortly afterward, help from Gauth al-Azam would arrive, crossing 800 years. How could such things be possible? Islamic scholars answer this question clearly. The spiritual influence and permission granted to awliya can continue even after their death, because their source was never their own independent power. Their source was Allah. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah repeated this throughout his entire life. "I am only a tool. The one who makes me speak is him. Remove me from between and see only him." The Juba prepared for Naqshband, the lines pointing toward the name Saeed, the duas through which Bediuzzaman found his lost belongings, the light extending toward Risali Nur. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah had seen all of it, because for him, time was not a veil. One afternoon, Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah was staring into the distance. His students were beside him. Suddenly they saw their master stand up. He rose slowly and turned toward a certain direction. It was as if a scent had reached him, a beautiful, familiar scent coming from very far away. The students looked at one another. Nobody spoke. Then Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah said, 157 years after my death, a great man will appear from this direction. Because Allah engraved dhikr into his heart, he will be called Naqshband. He will reach the blessings specially granted to me. He is a very great wali. When he appears, attach yourselves to him." Then he paused. After that, he went inside and prepared a jubba. He handed it to his students and said, "This juba belongs to the man named Naqshband, who will come after me. I leave it to you as a trust, so you may give it to him." 157 years later, when Muhammad Bahauddin Naqshband, rahimahullah, set out on his journey for Hajj, his route passed from Bukhara toward Baghdad. And when he arrived in Baghdad, that juba was given to him. The same juba Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah had prepared and entrusted 157 years earlier. Then Bahauddin Naqshband rahimahullah visited his blessed grave and wrote words of praise for Gauth al-Azam, because he knew this meeting was not coincidence. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah had seen him. He had known his name. He had prepared his juba. Time was not a barrier for him. But this was not the only example. There was another sign, stranger and reaching much farther into the future, a sign extending 800 years ahead. In the first volume of Abdul Qadir Gilani's work, called Majmu'at al-Ahzab, on page 562, in that sorrowful work where he spoke about unseen matters, there were references to a name, a service, and a light that would come centuries later. And that name was Saeed. Bediuzzaman Saeed Nursi rahimahullah himself mentions these signs in his own works. In Sikhi Tasdiki Gabi, he says, "In the story of my life, there were many extraordinary events, most of which I hid. Because I never saw myself worthy of karama in any way, I sometimes explained them through coincidence and sometimes through other causes. But now I have become convinced that these extraordinary events were part of a chain of karamas belonging to Gauth al-Azam." The name Saeed appeared openly on those old pages. It was also mentioned that he would live with dignity and happiness regarding sustenance. And truly, from his childhood onward, Bediuzzaman rahimahullah never lived dependent upon others. There was another sign as well. One expression from Gawth al-Azam, through Sayfar calculation, pointed toward the year 1326, Hijri, indicating that in that time a student would rise to defend the truths of the Quran through spiritual struggle. And in 1908, Bediuzzaman rahimahullah indeed stepped into that struggle. There was also another sign, more personal and more direct. When Bediuzzaman rahimahullah was only 8 or 9 years old, the people around him mostly belonged to the Naqshbandi tariqa, but young Said attached himself instead to Gawth al-Azam. Whenever he lost something, he would quietly say inside himself, "Ya Sheikh, help me find this thing of mine. I will recite one Fatiha for you." And shortly afterward, help from Gawth al-Azam would arrive. Crossing 800 years. How could such things be possible? Islamic scholars answer this question clearly. The spiritual influence and permission granted to awliya can continue even after their death, because their source was never their own independent power. Their source was Allah. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah repeated this throughout his entire life. "I am only a tool. The one who makes me speak is him. Remove me from between and see only him." The Juba prepared for Naqshband, the lines pointing toward the name Saeed, the duas through which Bediuzzaman found his lost belongings, the light extending toward Risali Nur. Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah had seen all of it, because for him, time was not a veil. It was February of the year 1166. Baghdad was cold, the streets were wet. For days the sky had been covered in a dark grey color, and Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah had fallen onto his sickbed. A life of 91 years, a life that had begun in the village of Nif in Jilan, grown in the streets of Baghdad, matured in the deserts, and shined from the pulpits. And now the final hours of that life were arriving. His students had gathered around him. Faces were tense, eyes were filled with tears, hands were raised in dua. Nobody wanted to speak. Finally, one of them could not hold back anymore and asked, "Ya Sayda, what is your illness? Where is the pain?" Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah opened his eyes. His voice was weak but clear. "Neither a jinn, nor a human, nor an angel. Nobody can know it or truly understand it." Silence fell over the room. Then his son Abdul Jabbar stepped forward. His voice trembled. "My father, where does it hurt?" Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah waited for a moment. Then he gave an answer that entered the hearts of everyone in that room and continued being repeated for centuries afterward. "Every part of me hurts, except my heart. There is no pain there. My heart is with Allah." Every part of him hurt. For 91 years, that body had carried many burdens. It had walked from Jilan to Baghdad. It had crossed deserts. It had completed Quran recitation standing on one foot. For 40 years, it had climbed the pulpit 3 times every week. Every part of him hurt, but the heart did not hurt, because the heart carried nothing belonging to dunya. The heart was only with Allah. During his final days, he continued giving advice to his students. "Never attach your hearts to dunya. Whatever you leave behind for the sake of Allah, you will find something better than it in the akhirah." Then he paused. He breathed deeply and continued, "Live as if only today remains from your life. Prepare yourselves for Allah." The students tried to write his words down, but their hands were shaking. The pens slipped between their fingers, because this lesson was not like the others. This was the final lesson. Another day passed. One of his sons approached him trying to help. He held his hand and adjusted his pillow, but Abdul Qadir Gilani rahimahullah stopped him and said, "Leave it. The one helping me is not in the same place as you." There were unseen beings beside him. The students could not see them, but he could. Then the final moment arrived. His lips were moving. The students came closer and listened carefully. What was he saying? "O Allah, my Rabb, do not leave me alone." He repeated it again and again. His voice slowly became weaker. The spaces between his breaths became longer. Then a moment came when his lips still moved, but no sound emerged. Then they stopped. He pressed his tongue against the roof of his mouth, and he surrendered his soul. At the end of his 91-year life, Abdul Qadir Jilani rahimahullah returned to the Rabb whom he loved and longed to meet. That day, Baghdad shut down. The news spread through the city, and as it spread, cries of grief rose from every door. Markets closed, the streets filled with people. An unimaginable crowd gathered for his janazah prayer. They came from different cities, different lands, and the visits to his grave continued for days, because the spiritual influence of Abdul Qadir Jilani rahimahullah did not end with his death. Imam Rabbani rahimahullah had once said, "All spiritual blessings reaching the awliya after him come through his path." And those words remained true, and they would continue remaining true. So what was left behind from that life? A madrasa, a blessed tomb, books such as Fath al-Rabbani, Gunyatut Talibin, and others. The Qadiri Tariqah, spreading across the world from Africa to Asia, from the Middle East to the Balkans, and millions of people, in every century, in every land, in every language. Even today, when people mention his name, they still lower their heads with respect. They still call him Goth al-Azam, and they still feel something move inside their hearts. But perhaps his greatest legacy was this: he came into this world as a human being. He grew up as an orphan. He left his mother behind. He faced bandits. He remained alone in the deserts. He fought Shaitan. He crushed his Nafs. He cried. He feared. He became tired. But he never gave up. And that alone was what entered human hearts for centuries. The true miracle was this: an ordinary human being could live an ordinary life with extraordinary surrender to Allah. With a promise taken from his mother, he could bring 60 men to Tawbah. He could stand on one foot until morning. He could separate his heart from dunya. And when every part of him was in pain, he could still keep his heart safe. The year was 1166. But for Abdul Qadir Jilani rahimahullah, history had not ended.